In 1347, a plague killed half of Europe, and the Church banned the examination that could have explained it. Within 4 years, between 25 and 50 million people were dead, more than the entire current population of Spain. The Church's explanation was divine punishment. To protect that explanation, it banned the one examination that could have contradicted it. The physicians who violated the ban found something else entirely. What they found is the reason epidemic medicine exists. That ban was not ignorance, it was a decision. The physician's name was Guy de Chauliac. He was practicing medicine in Avignon, the city where the Pope lived, watching the plague kill everything around him. He contracted it himself and kept working. The examinations he performed on the forbidden bodies revealed swollen lymph nodes in the groin and armpit, hemorrhagic tissue, the characteristic progression from exposure to death in days. He recorded every finding in a text called the Chirurgia Magna, completed in 1363. Anne Carmichael of Indiana University confirmed it is the first accurate clinical description of bubonic plague ever written in Europe. The Church that had forbidden the examinations never moved against the physician who performed them. The ban was not about the physician, it was about what opening a body would prove. But here's where the ban becomes something darker than a prohibition. The Church had not issued it from ignorance. Mondino de Luzzi had been opening forbidden bodies in Bologna since 1315. The ban was issued by an institution that had spent 30 years watching illegal dissection produce accurate anatomical knowledge. It knew. It banned plague autopsies anyway. The ban was not about what the physicians were doing. It was about what opening a body would prove and who that proof would destroy. The implication is impossible. The Church knew what open bodies revealed. It decided that knowledge was more dangerous than the plague. The ban was not about the dead. It was about what examining the dead would reveal about how disease actually spread, which had nothing to do with sin, which contradicted everything the Church was telling the people dying around it. The ban was a decision, not an error. The question is what the decision cost. The truly disturbing aspect isn't that the ban existed, it's what it cost. The ban failed. The physicians who violated it kept working. The knowledge passed through centuries of medical transmission and became the foundation of epidemic medicine. Every hospital that has ever treated an infectious disease, every vaccine ever administered, every antibiotic ever prescribed, every understanding of how disease spreads and how to stop it, all of it traces back to 1348. And a physician who opened what he was forbidden to open. The ban tried to prevent that knowledge. It failed. Everything medicine has saved since is the proof. The Chirurgia Magna still exists. The prohibition records alongside it are in the same archive. The ban and the knowledge it failed to prevent are filed together. Every life medicine has saved since is the proof. Number 9. On May 29, 1453, a 1,000-year empire fell, and within a generation the civilization that replaced it produced the Renaissance. The walls of Constantinople came down in an afternoon. But before they fell, for decades before and in the weeks after, something was leaving the city. Greek scholars, carrying manuscripts. The fall that ended Rome launched the world that followed it. The Biblioteca Medicea Lorenziana in Florence holds hundreds of those manuscripts today. Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, Archimedes. Works that Western Europe had not seen for 1,000 years arrived in Italian cities within a generation of the fall. The scholars who carried them, Bessarion, George of Trebizond, John Argyropoulos, taught Greek in Florence, Rome, and Venice. Within a generation of the fall, Greek was being read in Italian universities, and Archimedes was being studied by the men who would found modern science. But here's where the fall becomes a beginning rather than an ending. The manuscripts arrived in a Europe that had just invented the printing press. Gutenberg printed the Bible in 1455, 2 years after Constantinople fell. The texts the Greek scholars carried out of the city arrived in a world that could now reproduce them in unlimited quantities. Within decades, the knowledge preserved in Constantinople for 1,000 years was being printed in editions of thousands across Europe. The catastrophe was the delivery mechanism. The printing press was the amplifier. What followed was the Renaissance. The implication is impossible. For the Renaissance to have happened the way it happened, the fall of Constantinople had to have occurred after the printing press existed, but before the manuscripts it was dispersing had been lost forever. The Byzantine Empire had been weakening for decades. The scholars who cared most about the manuscripts had been leaving for generations, bringing texts to Italy, teaching Greek, building the intellectual infrastructure the Renaissance would need. The fall completed a transfer that had been underway for a century. The timing was not coincidental. The catastrophe and the capability arrived together. The truly disturbing aspect isn't that the empire fell, it's what the fall was carrying without knowing it. The Byzantine Empire had preserved the entire intellectual inheritance of ancient Greece and Rome for 1,000 years while Western Europe forgot it. When it fell, it dispersed that inheritance into exactly the right environment at exactly the right moment. The catastrophe was the mechanism. The Renaissance was the consequence. And everything the Renaissance produced was carried out of Constantinople in the arms of scholars who were trying to save what they loved. The manuscripts are in Florence, in Venice, in Rome, in libraries across Europe today. The scholars who carried them are named in the records of the Italian universities where they taught. The Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, every idea that defines Western civilization traces back through those manuscripts to the scholars who carried them out of a burning city. The modern world was built from what they carried out of a burning city. Number 8. In February 1258, the Mongol army burned the greatest library in the medieval world, and one astronomer carried out enough to change the history of science. The House of Wisdom held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, 5 centuries of Islamic mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. When the city fell, the Mongols threw the books into the Tigris. The river ran black with ink for days. Almost everything was gone. What he chose determined what science would know for the next 3 centuries. The House of Wisdom held the accumulated knowledge of 5 centuries of the Islamic Golden Age, translations of Greek texts that no longer existed anywhere else on Earth, mathematical proofs that had no equivalent in European scholarship, astronomical observations accumulated across centuries of Islamic scientific work. In a week, the Mongols destroyed what had taken 5 centuries to build. The Tigris ran black with ink for days. Almost all of it was gone, except what Tusi carried out. But here's where one man's choices changed the history of science. Nasir al-Din al-Tusi was the greatest astronomer and mathematician of the medieval Islamic world. Hulagu Khan recognized his value and allowed him to remove selected manuscripts before the burning began. Tusi carried what he carried to the Maraga Observatory in Persia, which Hulagu funded. At Maraga, using the manuscripts he had saved, Tusi produced astronomical tables of extraordinary precision. Historian George Saliba of Columbia University confirmed that specific mathematical techniques present in Copernicus's work appear in no European source prior to the Maraga transmission. The heliocentric model of the solar system was built on calculations derived from what one astronomer chose to save from a burning library in 1258. He chose, and what he chose determined what Copernicus would know. The implication is impossible. The House of Wisdom held the accumulated knowledge of 5 centuries. The margin between the scientific revolution happening and not happening was one astronomer's armful of manuscripts chosen in the minutes before a library burned. What Tusi saved was enough to change how humanity understands the solar system. What burned with it has never been measured because it cannot be measured. You cannot catalog what you do not know existed. The truly disturbing aspect isn't what burned, it's what almost burned with it. The Islamic Golden Age produced the mathematics, the astronomy, the medicine, the philosophy that the scientific revolution required. Almost all of it burned in Baghdad in 1258. What survived did so because one man was granted the right to carry selected manuscripts out of a building that was about to become ash. The margin was one man's armful. Everything that followed was built from what he carried. Tusi's astronomical tables survive in manuscript form in libraries across the Middle East and Europe. The Maragay Observatory's partial records survive. The chain from Baghdad to Maragay to Copernicus to modern astronomy is documented at every link, every telescope, every satellite, every understanding of the solar system and beyond. He chose. Everything that followed was built from what he carried. Number 7. In 2016, tree ring data from the Carpathian Mountains proved that the most powerful army in history was stopped by mud. The Mongol army that had just destroyed Hungary withdrew in the spring of 1242. For 700 years, historians blamed the death of the Great Khan. The tree ring data showed the winter of 1241 to 1242 was the warmest and wettest in decades. The Hungarian plains flooded. The horses could not move. One wet winter, and what that winter saved built the world you live in today. The Mongol army that invaded Hungary in 1241 had not lost a battle in a generation. It destroyed the Polish forces at Legnica. It destroyed the Hungarian forces at Mohi. Nothing stood between the Mongol cavalry and the undefended cities of Western Europe. Vienna, Venice, Paris, Rome, all of them open. Then the winter of 1241 to 1242 arrived warm and wet, the Hungarian plains flooded. Mongol cavalry required frozen ground to advance. What they found was mud. But here's where the tree ring data rewrites 700 years of explanation. Great Khan Ogadai died in December 1241. The withdrawal did not begin until spring 1242. Several months separate the death from the withdrawal. The withdrawal began when the ground became impassable, not when the political news arrived. The accepted explanation for 700 years was wrong. The mud was not secondary, it was the immediate physical cause. The implication is impossible. For Western Europe to have been saved from Mongol conquest, the specific weather conditions of a single winter in a specific mountain range had to have been unusually warm and wet at the exact moment the most powerful army in the world was positioned to advance. The Mongols had crossed frozen rivers before. They had operated in extreme conditions across the steppe. What stopped them was not cold. It was warmth, the wrong kind of winter in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Western Europe was not saved by military resistance. It was not saved by political cunning. It was saved by mud. The margin between that world existing and not existing was one wet winter. The truly disturbing aspect isn't that the Mongols left. It's what their leaving built. The Renaissance happened inside a Western Europe the Mongols did not conquer. The Reformation happened there. The Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the democratic revolutions that produced the modern world. Every idea that defines the modern world was built inside a civilization that survived because of one wet winter. The tree ring cores are at the University of Bern. The published analysis is in scientific reports. The Hungarian plains still flood in warm, wet springs. The withdrawal timeline is in the Mongol chronicles. The weather data and the withdrawal date align exactly. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment. Every idea that defines the modern world was built inside a civilization that survived because of one wet winter. The answer was in the trees for 700 years. It was just mud. Number 6. In 2013, DNA from 6th century plague victims proved that the pathogen that caused the Black Death had already killed a quarter of the world 800 years earlier. Researchers extracted the DNA from teeth of victims buried in a Bavarian cemetery dead for 1,400 years. The DNA identified Yersinia pestis, the exact strain. The warning existed in the clinical record the whole time. The gap that killed 25 million people is still open today. The plague of Justinian began in 541 and killed between 25 and 50 million people across the Mediterranean world. Procopius of Caesarea documented the symptoms in exact clinical detail: the buboes in the groin and armpit, the fever, the delirium, the death within days of onset. His account sat in European medical libraries for 800 years before 1347. The Black Death physicians had access to the same libraries. The connection was not made. The physicians of 1347 held books that described what was killing them. They could not read what the books were telling them. Here's where the gap becomes impossible to close in retrospect. The Justinianic plague accounts were not suppressed, not hidden. They were in the libraries alongside everything else medieval physicians read. The framework for recognizing a recurring pathogen across centuries did not exist. The warning was invisible not because it was hidden, but because nobody had built the framework to see it. The gap was not created by suppression. It was created by the absence of a framework that would not exist for another 5 centuries. The implication is impossible. The same pathogen introduced itself 800 years before the Black Death, left a clinical record in Procopius, left physical remains in Bavarian soil, left a DNA signature that survived 14 centuries of burial. None of it was enough. Every pandemic that has ever surprised humanity has left a record in the preceding clinical literature. The warning is always there. The framework for reading it always arrives too late. We close the gap after the catastrophe, never before. The truly disturbing aspect isn't that the warning was missed in 1347, it's that the same gap exists right now. COVID-19 left records in the coronavirus literature of the preceding decades. The next pandemic pathogen is in the clinical record somewhere today. We have not found it yet. The gap that killed 25 million people in the 14th century is the same gap that will define the next pandemic response. The DNA samples from the Bavarian cemetery are in laboratory storage. The Justinianic plague accounts are in European archives. The Black Death accounts are in the same archives. 800 years of warning and the catastrophe it failed to prevent are in the same archival tradition. The gap is still open. We have not found it yet. Number 5. On May 18, 1291, the last Crusader city fell, and the catastrophe that closed the land routes to Asia opened every ocean on Earth. The Mamluk army took Acre in one afternoon. 2 centuries of European military presence in the Holy Land ended. The overland routes to the spices, the silks, the goods that had flowed through the Crusader states were gone. Europe needed another way. The fall that ended the Crusades launched the age that connected the world. Within 2 centuries of the afternoon Acre fell, Portuguese navigators had mapped the African coast. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India by sea. In 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the Americas. The global trade network that built the modern economy opened within 2 centuries of one afternoon in 1291. Every continent on Earth was connected to every other within 2 centuries of one afternoon in 1291. But here's where the consequence chain becomes impossible to have predicted. The men who funded the voyages of exploration were not trying to connect the world. They were trying to reach Asian markets the fall of Acre had made inaccessible by land. The age of exploration was not an act of curiosity. It was an act of commercial necessity produced by a military catastrophe. Every consequence that followed, the discovery of the Americas, the Columbian Exchange, the transatlantic slave trade, the colonization of continents, the global economy, was set in motion by the afternoon the last Crusader city fell. The implication is impossible. For the age of exploration to have happened the way it happened, the fall of Acre had to have closed the land routes at precisely the moment when European maritime technology was advanced enough to attempt ocean crossings. The Portuguese had been developing caravel technology for decades before 1291. The catastrophe created the necessity. The capability made the necessity actionable. 2 centuries later, every ocean had been crossed. The truly disturbing aspect isn't that the Crusades ended. It's what ending them started. The fall of Acre in 1291 is the first link in the chain that produced Columbus in 1492, the Americas, the global economy, and the modern geopolitical order that defines every nation on Earth today. The catastrophe that ended 2 centuries of crusading launched the age that connected every civilization on the planet. The fall that closed one door opened every other one. The walls of Acre still partially stand in modern Akko in Israel. The Portuguese and Spanish records of the voyages of exploration are in national archives. Columbus's logs survive. The global trade network those voyages opened is the foundation of the modern economy. Every container ship crossing every ocean today is a consequence of the afternoon the last Crusader city fell. Number 4. Between 1315 and 1322, a famine killed 7 to 10 million people across Europe, and the survivors built the systems that have fed billions. More people died than currently live in Switzerland. The cause was invisible, a volcanic eruption on the other side of the planet that nobody in Europe knew had happened. The famine that killed millions produced the systems that saved everyone who came after. The cause was invisible. In 1258, the largest volcanic eruption in 7,000 years occurred somewhere in the tropics. The eruption injected enough sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere to cool the entire planet for decades. The cooling reduced the summer temperatures that European harvests depended on. In 1315, it began to rain across Europe and did not stop. The harvest failed. The following year, it failed again. For 7 consecutive years, crops rotted in flooded fields. A volcanic eruption on the other side of the planet cooled the climate for decades. The people who starved felt only the cold. They never knew what was killing them. But here's where the survivors built something the catastrophe could not destroy: grain storage, crop diversification, agricultural resilience. Systems that had never existed before the famine forced them into existence. The communities that survived built infrastructure to hold reserves against future failures. They diversified crops so no single failure could destroy an entire harvest. They refined rotation systems to maximize resilience. One catastrophe produced the tools that survived the next one. The implication is impossible. The famine killed millions. The systems it forced into existence fed the recovery that followed the Black Death 30 years later. The population that had been devastated by famine and then by plague rebuilt itself on the agricultural foundation the famine had forced into existence. The catastrophe produced the resilience. The resilience survived the next catastrophe, and what that resilience built fed every generation that came after. The truly disturbing aspect isn't the scale of the famine, it's the scale of what it built. Every modern food security system, grain reserves, crop diversification, famine relief infrastructure, international food aid, traces its foundational logic to the innovations famine survivors built in the 14th century. The famine killed 7 to 10 million people. The systems it produced have saved billions. The grain storage architecture built across Europe after the famine is still standing in some locations. The agricultural records documenting the innovations are in European archives. The modern food security systems that trace their logic to those innovations feed billions of people today. The famine killed millions. What the survivors built has saved billions. Number 3. On April 13, 1360, a hailstorm fell on a field outside Chartres and produced through a chain of consequences every democracy in the modern world. Edward III had been winning the 100 Years' War for 23 years. He was 4 days from Paris. Hailstones larger than goose eggs fell from a clear spring sky. Over 1,000 of his men and horses died in hours. He fell to his knees in the field. 4 days later, he signed the Treaty of Bretigny and gave back most of what England had won. The storm that stopped a king built the political foundation of the world you live in today. The chronicle accounts of Black Monday survive in multiple sources. Jean Froissart, the Chronique de France, the Anonymal Chronicle. Writers in different languages with different political allegiances describe the same event in the same terms. Hailstones larger than goose eggs, horses killed where they stood, men who had survived Crécy and Poitiers killed by weather in hours. Edward fell to his knees in the field. Every source that recorded it describes the same king in the same field in the same storm. The storm happened, the king fell. 4 days later he signed. But here's where the treaty reveals the chain of consequences nobody could have predicted in 1360. Edward gave up the English claim to the French throne. The war eventually resumed. The resumed war produced a peasant girl from Lorraine who led French armies to a series of impossible victories and was burned alive for them. Joan of Arc produced the French national consciousness that unified a fractured kingdom. That consciousness produced the Revolution of 1789. The Revolution produced the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Jefferson used it as a model for the documents that defined the American Republic. The hailstorm that stopped a king is the first link in the chain that produced modern democracy. One afternoon of weather, the longest chain of consequences in political history. The implication is impossible. Remove the storm, and Edward takes Paris. England rules France. Joan of Arc has no cause to fight for. The French national consciousness that produced the revolution does not emerge in the same form. Jefferson works from a different model, or none. The modern democratic world is built differently, or not at all. The margin between the world as it is and a world where Edward III ruled France was one afternoon of hailstones outside Chartres. The truly disturbing aspect isn't that the storm changed the outcome of one war. It's what the chain of consequences reveals about the fragility of the modern world's foundations. Every democracy that exists today traces its logic through the French revolutionary tradition to Joan of Arc, to the Treaty of Bretigny, to a hailstorm on April 13, 1360. The field where it fell still exists. The treaty it produced is in the French National Archives. Everything traces back to one field outside Chartres. The Treaty of Bretigny is in the French National Archives. The chronicle accounts of Black Monday are in multiple European archives. The field outside Chartres still exists. Joan of Arc's trial records survive in Rouen. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man is in the same National Archive as the treaty that set the chain in motion. One hailstorm, one king on his knees. Every democracy in the world today is a consequence of what fell from the sky on April 13, 1360. Number 2. In January 1077, the most powerful secular ruler in Europe stood barefoot in the snow outside a castle in Canossa, and what those 3 days produced is the foundation of every democracy in the world today. Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV had been excommunicated by Pope Gregory VII in 1076. He had come to beg for absolution. Gregory made him wait 3 days in the snow before granting it. The image of an emperor in the snow permanently changed how the world is organized. The dispute that brought Henry to Canossa was about power. Who controlled the church within the Holy Roman Empire? The Pope said only he could appoint bishops and abbots. The emperor said church officials within his territory were his subjects and he would appoint them. The investiture controversy, The 50-year war between popes and emperors over this question was the first systematic confrontation between religious authority and secular authority in the history of Western civilization. The outcome of that dispute determined how the modern world would be organized. But here's where the resolution produced something neither side intended. The Concordat of Worms in 1122 ended the conflict with a compromise. The emperor retained the right to invest bishops with secular authority. The pope retained the right to invest bishops with spiritual authority. For the first time in European history, the spiritual and secular domains were formally and legally separated. The principle that religious authority and political authority were distinct was written into a document both sides signed. That principle is the foundation of every modern democracy. The implication is impossible. For modern democracy to exist the way it exists, the principle of the separation of church and state had to have been established and defended across centuries of institutional practice before it could be written into democratic constitutions. The Concordat of Worms established the principle in 1122. The Magna Carta extended it in 1215. The English Bill of Rights reinforced it in 1689. The American First Amendment enshrined it in 1791. The chain from Canossa to the First Amendment is unbroken and documented at every link. Every vote cast in every democratic election in the world today is cast inside a system built on what happened at Canossa. The truly disturbing aspect isn't that an emperor stood in the snow for 3 days. It's what those 3 days built across 9 centuries. Every constitutional democracy in the world operates on the principle that religious authority and political authority are separate. That principle was established in the confrontation between Gregory VII and Henry IV. The emperor who stood in the snow did not know he was building democracy. He was trying to keep his throne. The principle he was forced to accept outlasted every throne that has ever existed. The Concordat of Worms is in the Vatican archives. The chronicle accounts of Henry IV's walk to Canossa survive in multiple sources. The Magna Carta is in the British Library. The American First Amendment is in the National Archives in Washington. The chain from the snow outside Canossa to the constitutional democracies of the modern world is documented at every link. Henry IV stood in the snow for 3 days. Every democracy in the world today was built from what those 3 days produced. Number 1. In November 885, a Viking army of 40,000 besieged Paris, and the king who did not come built through his failure every constitution ever written. Count Odo of Paris held the city with 200 men for almost a year without royal help. When the Frankish king Charles the Fat finally arrived in October 886, he paid the Vikings to leave without fighting. Within 2 years he was deposed. The king who paid the Vikings to leave built more than he could have imagined. He built the foundation of the modern world. Count Odo of Paris held the city with 200 men for almost a year without royal help. He repaired the bridges the Vikings destroyed. He held the towers the Vikings attacked. He fed the defenders through a siege that lasted 11 months. When Charles finally came, he did not fight, he paid. The Viking army that had been fought to a standstill by 200 men was paid to leave by the king of the largest empire in Western Europe. Charles was deposed within 2 years. Odo became king. Feudalism did not emerge from a plan. It emerged from the vacuum Charles the Fat left when he paid the Vikings to leave. But here's where the feudal system becomes the unlikely foundation of modern democracy. After the siege, the failure of royal protection was visible and complete. Across France, in the decades following, nobles began building castles, raising armies, and extracting oaths of loyalty from the people on their land in exchange for the protection the king had proven he could not provide. Those nobles eventually became powerful enough to constrain royal authority. In 1215, a group of English barons forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, the first legal document establishing that rulers were subject to law. The Magna Carta was only possible because feudalism had created nobles powerful enough to force a king's hand. Feudalism was only possible because a king had proven he could not be relied upon. That king was Charles the Fat. That proof was Paris in 886. The implication is impossible. For modern democracy to exist the way it exists, feudalism had to have created nobles powerful enough to force a king to sign the Magna Carta. For feudalism to have created those nobles, the royal authority it replaced had to have failed visibly and completely enough to justify the transfer of protective power to local lords. The most complete and visible failure of royal authority in the early medieval period was a king who paid an invading army to leave a city his count had defended alone for a year. The chain from that payment to the Magna Carta to the American Constitution is unbroken. One king's failure, 11 centuries of consequences. The truly disturbing aspect isn't that a king failed to defend his capital, it's the length of the chain that failure set in motion across 11 centuries. Charles the Fat paid the Vikings and was deposed. Feudalism emerged from the vacuum. Feudal nobles forced the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta established that rulers were subject to law. That principle crossed the Atlantic with English colonists. The American founders built a constitution on it. Every constitutional democracy in the world today traces its foundational principle back through the Magna Carta, to the feudal nobility, to the night a Frankish king did not come to defend Paris. He paid the Vikings to leave. Every constitution ever written is a consequence of what that payment failed to protect. 10 catastrophes, 10 margins, 10 worlds that almost did not exist. The Black Death produced epidemic medicine. The fall of Constantinople produced the Renaissance. The burning of Baghdad produced modern astronomy. The mud of Hungary produced the Reformation and the Enlightenment. The plague of Justinian left a gap we still have not closed. The fall of Acre connected the world. The Great Famine fed the billions who came after. A hailstorm produced democracy. An emperor in the snow produced the separation of church and state. A king who did not come produced every constitution ever written. Every catastrophe on this list almost ended everything. None of them did. And the world you live in today was built from what survived. The chronicle accounts of the Viking siege survive in multiple sources, including the eyewitness account of Abbo of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, who witnessed the siege. The feudal charters produced across France in the decades following are in French National Archives. The Magna Carta is in the British Library. The American Constitution is in the National Archives in Washington. The chain from the night Charles the Fat did not come to the constitution of every modern democracy is documented at every link. He paid the Vikings to leave. Every constitution ever written is a consequence of what that payment failed to protect. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.